you're not really living, because you're becoming a zombie, you're becoming a robot, you're becoming a slave, and you respond to other people's needs, and you're not making choices. We need to paint a picture that everybody understands of how society could work in a different level, different way, with simple law, where ideas are distributed, where organizations work to look after people, to create peace, to create relationships.
But the irony is, of course, that the freedom that people have been given is not really freedom at all, is it? Because when slavery comes in, there's outbreaks of sexual immorality and all sorts of poor behaviour. And I've always felt that was related to the fact that people are so disempowered in their everyday life that they take control of the only thing that they can, and that's their own bodies.
To understand that the poor need the rich. There's exactly the other way around. In order to exercise responsibly your custodianship, if you have resources that you don't need, and what rich means here is you have resources beyond what you need, then the rich require the poor because they need, as it were, people with whom they can partner and with whom they can share that wealth, and in order to be able to create a society which is functional and thereby meet their obligations.
The Manna Journey is the catalyst for change in our world. It's a consistent source of truth for the next generation and current leaders. Our mission is to change the world by reframing our current governance, by using ancient wisdom to solve modern problems, and by shaping innovative new businesses to have a culture of pursuit of purpose.
Is the law working for modern society, and is the Bible the place to look for how we can redesign our legal system? Well, Philip Ullman thinks we can learn from the Bible, and this is part of the Manna Journey, a series that looks at how we can bring more Bible study and more understanding into our modern everyday life. I'm joined, of course, by Philip Ullman, but also by Harvey Bolofsky, who is the Emeritus Rabbi of the Golders Green Synagogue. Harvey, welcome. Philip, welcome. If I believe everything that we've discussed here, if I say to myself, yes, okay, narrative and law must be put together, right? And you know, we talked about Sarah's law. It's fairly obvious that you could pass the law and say, this happened to the little girl in question. Here's the story of it, and here's the law that's related to it. You could do that. We haven't done it, but you could do it. But if you also think that law's overly prescriptive and it creates a situation where there's conflict, and the conflict is made worse, a fuel is poured on the fire. What do we do today to look at this?
Well, it's bigger than that, because when you divorce law from narrative, you don't know where you're going to go. Nobody's painting a picture of a society where we care for each other, where we have distributed organizations with local teams. As Harvey said, if you're not making decisions, if you're not making choices, you're not really living, because you're becoming a zombie, you're becoming a robot, you're becoming a slave, and you respond to other people's needs, and you're not making choices. We need to paint a picture that everybody understands of how society could work in a different level, different way, with simple law, with a system of flow where ideas are distributed, where organizations work to look after people, to create peace, to create relationships. And then suddenly, okay, that's the way the law is, that's the narrative, and let's connect the law so the law actually starts to achieve that narrative.
There's a lot of the law that gets put on the statute books, which is pointless. I mean, I think Tony Blair created 400 new criminal offences, and somebody told me that one of them was murder by nuclear explosion. Which, I mean, the idea that having a nuclear weapon, blowing it up, or killing people was legal previously. But of course, it just means that you get torrents and torrents of paperwork. And I just wonder whether the better idea would be just to start deleting it. That's not to say there's a free-for-all, because there's still, you can't kill. They might not be as prescriptive anymore, but it sounds more sensible.
Without returning to principles, the starting point is a recognition that pretty much all of the rules that appear in the Jewish Bible are intended to create relationships between people. Yeah. And they recognize that the additional resources that one may have are the property of God. One is a custodian, and then they have to be administered accordingly. That means, in principle, if you had spare money, if you had a spare property, there are because of the prohibition of charging interest, and there are many other examples. It is actually very difficult to use it in a way that produces additional money. If you're allowing other people to use it to benefit from it, this also has an anti-inflationary impact. And you start from once everything becomes about relationship building and a recognition that economic activity is in the interest not of shareholders but of stakeholders, which include all people involved, employees, the resources of the planet, etc., etc. There are 2 or 3 very simple principles in which all of these laws are based, which could form the basis of an alternative way of thinking about these constructs.
And it's a very conservative way of looking at life. So we're not saying, and the Bible's not saying that everybody's the same. It doesn't say that. And it doesn't say there's anything it talks about there's wealthy and there's poor. It discusses it. It's very real. But what it's saying is you have to build relationships and you have to use the resources that you've got to look after family, community and society. But so you could have a decent sized house, but when you start having yachts and you start having a whole, then there's a point where we're going to damage relationships.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you've said that. You're obviously driving at something that there would be a criticism of doing this that is remarkably anti-capitalist. I'm not sure it necessarily is.
It's not. It's anti-libertarianism. The trusteeship is saying no. We're trustees, which is in fact the way Cadbury's, all the organisations not that long ago used to operate. They would care for each other and they would look after everybody and they recognise those responsibilities. So what we've done is we've gone so far to libertarianism where they can do whatever they want and there's no limits and everyone's free without any obligations. That's the problem. The problem is no obligations. The problem is not...
But the irony is, of course, that the freedom that people have been given is not really freedom at all, is it? Because, I mean, I see, and there are examples in the Bible where when slavery comes in, there's outbreaks of sexual immorality and all sorts of poor behaviour. And I've always felt that was related to the fact that people are so disempowered in their everyday life that they take control of the only thing that they can, and that's their own bodies.
So once you've commodified, once you've made all decisions at the centre, so everybody at the lower levels in organisations are things effectively. They're robots. And once you become a robot, as indeed I think is the case with the Israelites in the second phase, in the beginning of Exodus, where they become they produce bricks. They're brick producers, and they've got to produce it with a limited resource, which is the straw. And all they're doing is producing brick after brick. They may be getting food, but their work is meaningless. They've got daily targets in terms of how many bricks they've got to produce, but it becomes a meaningless life. And once you're a commodity and you become, you're treated by it, and you think you actually are a thing, and then you end up commodifying things which you shouldn't be commodifying, which is sexual relationships become...
Your worth is determined by what you can produce. Once you do that, then you begin to see yourself in a kind of dehumanized way. And I think that plays into kind of what you're saying, what Philip's been saying.
And what we've done, we don't have slavery in our time in terms of ownership. That may have gone that in the last few hundred years. But what hasn't gone is the control and the centralisation of power and the enslavement to debt and the enslavement. That is very much real, and people are not free. They don't do jobs they love to do because many people have got a big mortgage, etc.
But that would evaporate overnight if the law was about saying, yes, you own a company, yes, you're the chief executive or whatever it is, but you have a duty. You have to understand that you're not just there for the bottom line. You're not just there for the profit. The law itself is telling you that you're a steward, that you're a custodian.
Correct. And once you have you see the role of the state as not escalating, not taking decisions away from people and creating this enormous state which taxes away and then starts to allocate based on central decisions, and you distribute it to people, and you start to see, 1 minute, we don't want to take power away. We want to actually de-escalate. We want to make sure that if there's a dispute between two people, one person's got money, the other person hasn't got money, and there's a need, for example, in a particular town to build streets or to build a school. You want to actually resolve it locally with a form of discussion and mediation. If it doesn't work, you then get more people involved. And then the state becomes a peacemaking state rather than a confiscatory state.
But Philip, this begs an inevitable question. I get the whole narrative element, but what happens if we were to take the body of law that we've got in this country now and we were to create effectively a simple textbook that has the narrative behind why laws exist and an explanation of those laws? Wouldn't that be enough to satisfy what you need?
No, because we need to decide what the overall narrative for the country is. We need to think about the UK. The UK is in a tremendous position, and we have a track record of changing the world via the Industrial Revolution. We've got the intellect, we're an island, we've got the ability, and it's a lovely place. It's been very good to all of us, this country, and we're grateful to this country, but it's not firing on all cylinders because effectively it's almost ground to a halt.
You're right. But on the other hand, in order to be able to determine what this book would contain, you've got to set out determine all the principles first. You can't just take the existing law and simplify it. That will be a useful task, and from there you can work out what's wrong with it. I'm thinking back to something you said before. One of Philip's favourite thinkers, Rabbi Hirsch, who was writing in mid-19th century Germany, points out that the normal narrative is to understand that the poor need the rich. That's how it works, because the poor have needs and the rich have to, and they need the largesse of the rich in order to be able to get by. He says it's exactly the other way around. That given that in order to exercise responsibly your custodianship, if you have resources that you don't need, and what rich means here is you have resources beyond what you need to live, then the rich require the poor because they need, as it were, people with whom they can partner and with whom they can share that wealth, and in order to be able to create a society which is functional and thereby meet their obligations. The responsibility of wealth, it's not a phrase that I made up, but the responsibility of wealth is a very major, it's a privilege and a responsibility, but it's not, as it were, it's not an exeat from human responsibility.
No, and once, as Harvey's mentioned before, it's about building relationships, and we all crave healthy relationships, and we delude into thinking the bigger the number we have in our bank account, the happier you are, which is clearly not the case. It has to be about relationships, and that's why Harvey's absolutely right. Once you see yourself as having resources and obligations, you look at how you can build relationships, which requires seeing yourself as a trustee, and from the state's perspective, starting to ensure that we have a system which distributes responsibility, which actually de-escalates disputes, which actually creates a loving resolution of conflict rather than escalation with a complicated law, etc.
But I was going to say, as you know, but I'm not as au fait with a lot of these scripts and texts as you are. But the Israelites become less and less keen on leaving Egypt the more enslaved they become, and that, of course, is a really odd concept for most people. But it's to do with institutionalization, surely.
It's the same. A town where you've got third generation on benefits, and you say to them, and in some cases there's immorality, there's drugs, there's gangs, there's prostitution, all of that kind of stuff. It's hard to envisage, because the state is so kind to them and looks after these people, a life where they start taking responsibility for this. But you have to change the narrative. You've got to say,
I think the transition is extremely difficult, because clearly no one is suggesting that one should just abolish the state system which supports so many people who are in need. But moving, and the transition to a healthier system is extremely complicated, and I might leave that to people who are more expert in these things than I am. But acknowledging that it doesn't work, and yet people need to be properly looked after, is a good starting point. It's about partnership and relationships, rather than a sort of, I would say, from a Jewish perspective, a concept of charity which is unfamiliar. The notion of charity is very much, well, I have these resources, and if I feel like it, if I feel so moved, then I might share some of those or give them to those who are less advantaged. The way the Jewish Bible understands it uses the word tzedek. The word tzedek means something which is right or correct or required, a moral obligation, because ultimately these resources belong to God and He instructs us how to distribute them.
So I think we've illustrated how a simple narrative supported by simple law actually protects the many. They can start looking after themselves, you can paint a picture of a society which is thriving with trusteeship, with distribution of power, with decision-making made locally, people brought back to life, we end enslavement. And it's not that complicated. We just need to look at stuff that were made historically and start to rethink some of those fundamental issues. We live in a wonderful time where the technology is immensely powerful, where you can start sharing information, you can create a degree of accountability that we never have been able to in the past. We need to harness that technology and start to actually create that narrative and start to create laws that actually reflect the narrative.
And the irony is the answers are in the book.
They are.
Yeah. But I do want one needs to acknowledge that it can be done, but the transition is very complicated and that needs a lot of very specialised thinking. But I think that, as you say, the answers in the book.